Every day, 3.5 billion people get up and work. For some, work will be a fulfilling, empowering, well-paid experience. But for far too many, work will be unfulfilling, underpaid, and at times unsafe. And for those who speak up and attempt to organize and improve their conditions, they could be met with dismissals from work. And for some who seek to defend worker rights in some of the darkest corners of the global economy, they might be met with violence. I know, because I almost lost my life twice in my efforts to defend workers' rights. These experiences have shaped me and motivated me for the last 20 years in the research I do on workers' rights and efforts to address these abuses. In the late 1980s, after studying in Boston and doing some union organizing there, I moved to El Salvador. The country was in the midst of a violent civil war. Trade unionists were being arrested, some were being tortured. My job was to document these abuses with the hope that by getting the word out, this would provide some degree of protection. And we were partly successful in this work. In fact, these were some of the most fulfilling years of my life. Every day that I got up, I felt the work I was doing in some small way was contributing to change. But then things got difficult for me. I was taken from my home in the early morning hours by a military security force. I was put in a basement detention center, a basement cell. I was stripped to my underwear, blindfolded, handcuffed. I was denied food and water and forced to stay standing for long periods of time and asked about my worker rights activism. I was released 2 days later, thanks to an international and national campaign. Friends and colleagues of mine were not so lucky. Dozens who were detained around the same time were sent to prison. But then, the very next month, the labor union office where I worked was bombed at lunchtime. 9 friends and colleagues were killed that day. One of them was FABE Elizabeth Velasquez. FABE was a garment worker. She rose up in the ranks and she became a union organizer. She was also an outspoken critic of the government and the worker rights abuses in the country. She was sitting with me when she was killed. I barely survived, receiving a severe head injury. But you know what? These extreme experiences at that time were not so exceptional in El Salvador. In fact, in the early years of the war, 5,125 labor rights activists were killed. Today, in countries such as Guatemala and Colombia and beyond, worker rights advocates are still being killed. I returned to the US. I had some medical procedures. I studied for a bit, got a master's degree, and then I returned to El Salvador. The country was going through an intense transition, not only from war to peace, it was transitioning its entire economic model. Export processing zones, industrial parks full of garment factories were mushrooming across the country. But with them, so too were worker rights violations. I became very involved in one campaign in a factory called Mandarin, where workers had been fired for trying to form a union. The campaign was international, and it was eventually successful. I'll never forget the day when I met with those workers in front of the factory gates, and we walked in together, and I watched them return to their workplaces and begin work again. It was one of the biggest success stories for garment worker organizing in the country. The workers not only returned to work, they returned with their union intact. But for me, the euphoria would be short-lived. A few days later, 3 men broke into my home. One put a gun to my head, another put a gun to my chest, and they held me there. and they were waiting for the rush hour traffic to die down so they could take me with them. Luckily, a neighbor saw what happened. She called the police. When the police eventually arrived, the 3 men fled. I originally tried to tell myself this was a kidnapping attempt, but the police told me otherwise. You see, the men made no attempt to cover their faces. And that was because they had no expectation I would be around later to identify them. What happened to me that day was directly linked to my worker rights advocacy and the return of those unionists to their jobs. In the period that followed, I started to become more and more aware of how these multiple traumas, experiences were starting to affect me. There's this constant sense of anxiety, this sense of unease in my gut that I just couldn't get rid of. I always felt hyper vigilant. I was on alert all the time. I just couldn't get that sensation away. But I buried myself in work, lots and lots of work to control those sensations. I went back to the US. I went to Cornell University. I worked on getting a PhD. I began publishing on worker rights. I then got a job at Penn State. I began teaching on worker rights, publishing more on worker rights. I was getting awards and recognitions for my work. In many ways, it seemed like my life was a tremendous success. A PhD from Cornell University, a job as a professor at a Research One institution. But deep inside, I was still burning up with anxiety. And I was also increasingly suffering from chronic headaches. They were becoming unbearable. Eventually, a primary care physician suggested we do a brain scan. What those brain scan results would show would change my life. You see, it turns out I have a condition called Chiari malformation. Chiari is when the skull is just a little too small for the brain. Many adults can have this condition and be asymptomatic their entire lives. But if you have a brain injury, a concussion, like I did when the labor union office was bombed, what happens is the brain expands with the concussion, but it has nowhere to go. And the brain tonsils herniate downward, and slowly they block the flow of cerebral spinal fluids, causing the chronic, excruciating headaches. In 2006, I had something called decompression brain surgery. 3 neurosurgeons operated on me for 7.5 hours. Afterwards, the cerebral spinal fluids began to flow again. And slowly, very slowly, those chronic headaches that had debilitated me for so long began to dissipate. Afterwards, I began a period of reflection. And here's one of my thoughts from that period. When we go through such traumatic experiences, we can either get pushed inward and the world can become a very scary place, or if we allow them, we can reflect on them and use those experiences to be a source of empowerment, to give us vision and a deeper sense of purpose. These processes are never easier, they're never linear. But eventually for me, with time, a lot of time, I began to see how I could use that process. I still continue to work hard, but I do so with a greater sense of calmness and clarity. And I also feel like I can use and draw on my experiences to very quickly identify and connect with workers and their stories of abuse. I continued my travels. I went back to Latin America. I was in Vietnam and Bangladesh and India. Everywhere I went, I felt I could very quickly connect with workers and their stories of abuse. And I became almost obsessed with finding the answer as a researcher, the answer to one very basic question. Why is it, if the global garment industry generates billions of dollars in profits every year, are worker rights abuses so endemic to the sector? I began probing this argument with a very simple data set. I started looking at the prices brands and retailers were paying to make our garments, And I found a continual decline. And then for those same countries, for the same period of time, I mapped out respect for workers' rights. The correlation was really apparent. As brands squeezed down on prices, respect for worker rights declined precipitously. I then became very interested in this question of abuse at work. And what I was finding was that as the prices got squeezed down, factory owners were demanding workers work faster and faster and faster. They were being told to do 60 operations an hour to keep their jobs, and they had to do 80 operations to do their jobs. In some cases, they had to do 100 operations to keep their jobs. And when they couldn't meet these inhumane production targets, they were yelled at and at times hit. My research showed, survey research, that 64% of garment workers in India experienced verbal abuse at work. These sourcing practices, my research showed, were contributing to gender-based violence at work. When the COVID pandemic hit, all these trends were exacerbated and new problems emerged. We documented this in a research report with the Worker Rights Consortium. And what we found was that brands and retailers responded to COVID by abruptly canceling orders, billions and billions in dollars of orders. The impact on workers and the factories was devastating. Workers were sent home in many cases without their severance pay, without salary. Soon, the majority of garment workers and their families were reporting cases of malnutrition. We then put up a public tracker which showed which companies had paid up and which companies had not paid up. Very soon, a movement emerged demanding brands pay up what was owed. Facebook, Twitter, media accounts, Instagram lit up with accounts of the impact of these cancellations on workers and their lives. Within months, $22 billion were paid up. One longtime activist referred to this as the single greatest achievement for worker rights advocacy in the garment sector in decades. I am now the founding director of a research center and a master's program in global workers' rights with some of the most incredible professors and students from around the world. I'm working actively on campaigns for living wages and respect for freedom of association rights through binding agreements. And here's my takeaway from all of this. I believe we can all tap into our most trying experiences and use that for our own sense of empowerment to promote change. So my question for all of you today is this: what experiences have impacted you in your lives? And how might you use them for your own sense of empowerment, purpose, and clarity to contribute to some of the changes that this world so desperately needs? Thank you very much.